Thank you again for joining us tonight for our second appointment of Dante Settecento, our series of events celebrating Dante Alighieri on the 700th anniversary of his death. My name is Tiziana Cervesato. I'm the Director of Events at the Italian Cultural Center. And for our second talk tonight, I'm very happy to welcome back our speaker, Pieranna Garavaso, Professor Emerita of Philosophy, who taught for 34 years at the University of Minnesota in Morris. And Professor Garavaso is now devoting a lot of time reading and discussing Italian literature, and it's a true pleasure to work with her on these events. Before I give the word to Pieranna Garavaso, I just want to tell a quick reminder to everyone to please keep yourselves muted during the presentation. The presentation will last about 45 minutes, and then we'll have time for questions and answers. You can also choose various speaker views in the top right corner of your screen. And from the very beginning, also, if you have questions, feel free to type them directly in the chat. And for your information, we are recording this presentation. And so it is my pleasure now to give the word to Pieranna Garavaso. Enjoy the presentation.
Thank you, Tiziana, for your kind words, as usual. I want to thank Tiziana also because the slides you will see are part also of her work. She is a great helper in making them making more sense and being pleasant to look at. The content too of the slides is a content that I discussed with Tiziana, so she is really a big help in this. I'm not an expert on Dante, but I love to talk about him because as an Italian, when you have an education in Italian school, if you in particular went to a high school, either the classic or the scientific high school, you do read Dante and you read the whole Divine Comedy. And so it has been really a pleasure for me, a challenge and a pleasure to go back and try to relearn what and try to update what I have learned in school a long time ago. So I'm going to share my screen with you, and we're going to start um, talking about what I think I tried to put in this presentation. When I was preparing it and thinking about the Divine Comedy, I was trying to put in my slides and this conversation with you the aspects of this work that I was hoping would be of interest to an audience that is multilingual and multicultural, like the audience of the Italian Cultural Center. And I encourage you to, of course, ask questions. I have begged Tiziana to give us a little more time so we can go on with the question maybe until 7:15. And and so I really do hope there are no silly questions, you know. And as I said, I enjoy learning, and so your questions are often very stimulating. The Divine Comedy I rediscovered, has been very influential for writers, English writers, like T.S. Eliot, for example, Ezra Pound, several English writers that have been influenced by this uh, author. So this second slide is really the one that summarizes a little bit what we talked about last time. Last time, I tried to focus on his life, and I tried to focus on the political and historical background or context in which Dante lived. So in this slide, I decided to remind you of the important moments of his life. And also here, following up with a suggestion that came from your feedback, which is always very important. We decided to prepare a handout that I know Tiziana has shared with you. So I will not go over the detail on this one, but I thought it might be helpful to you to have this under your eyes when we talk about the work. One thing, sorry, I wanted to go back, and that slide was very helpful to remind me. Is that last time I really didn't spend much time pointing out who Beatrice was. Beatrice was a very important woman in Dante's life. I want to say that Dante and Beatrice in Italian culture are what Juliet and Romeo and Juliet are in British and English culture. They are the symbol of a couple bound by a very strong tie of love. Actually, if you think about, they didn't marry because Dante married Gemma Donati, and they actually saw each other supposedly 2 times when they were 9 years old and when they were 18 years old. So it's kind of a mystery and an interesting point, the fact that he devoted, he talks about Beatrice in his Vita Nuova when he wrote practically the story of his love for her. And then he puts her in paradise, and she is his guide in paradise. So Beatrice Portinari, who, as you can see, died very young as well, she was born in the same year as Dante, has an important role in the Divine Comedy. Okay, I wanted to go back to a question that was a very good question that one of the members of the audience raised last time, and that was, why is the day in which we celebrate Dante on March 25th? And so I discovered that there are a lot of questions about, in a sense, why that particular day. The day was the day in which supposedly one interpretation puts the beginning of the journey that Dante makes in the Divine Comedy. But it is disputed because other people said, other interpreters said that he started his travel, his journey on the 8th of April. And the whole reason why one day or the other was the beginning of the Divine Comedy and the beginning of the travel has to do with a lot of elements that I put in parentheses there. Some are religious, some are having to do with the season. And so it's not a question that has an easy answer, but I wanted to go back to it because some of you had shown quite a bit of interest in that date. Okay, now I'll focus on some of the main characters, features of the Divine Comedy, and then go more and more in detail. I have to say, when I started preparing this, I had proposed to Tiziana that our second meeting would be on the Divine Comedy, and I will talk about the whole work, but I had to say it's impossible to cover the three parts. And so much of what I say today will be about Inferno, which is in any case the most popular part, even among Italians. And then we'll talk a little bit about Purgatorio and Paradiso. So the work is divided in tre cantiche, and cantiche is a word that here you have to interpret like you would say part one of a novel. Those are the major divisions. And then within those divisions, we have the canti. And a canto, it seems to me the best way to understand it is as you would understand a chapter in a novel, is a subpart of a part. And in the Divine Comedy, we have 34 cantos for the Inferno and 33 for each of the other part. Now, in the comedy, numbers are very important. And I'm not an expert on it, but I know that there is a whole area of studies of Dante's Divine Comedy that focuses on his use of numbers. 9 was a sacred number, was very important, and you will see that the divisions of the Inferno and Purgatorio and Paradiso have similar numbers. So the comedy was not really called divine by Dante. He didn't call it divine. It was Boccaccio who called it divine. And we can talk a little more, I hope in the discussion, we will get to talk a little more about Boccaccio's role really in the development of the interest for the Divine Comedy. Boccaccio was a writer of great stories. The Decameron, of course, is his masterpiece, and it was a little bit later than Dante. He called it divine because it's a work that starts from a situation of sorrow, despair, and discomfort, and reaches a place of happiness and peace. So Dante's journey is a journey that ends as a good ending. And because of that reason, it's a comedy. It is divine because it has a religious meaning of resurrection, atonement, and so on. One of the aspects of the comedy, which is really, I think, interesting for everybody, is the architecture, the very complicated structure of these three different domains of the world. And I wanted to give you this representation, which was done quite early, in 1882, the author of this, Michelangelo Caetani, actually died. And so he probably did this in the middle of the 1800s. And you can see there are details that we will look at more in a different representation with Jerusalem here and all different rounds, gironi. You can see La Città di Dite, these are the walls of the city of Dis, and other different circular distinction. But I knew that this wasn't going to be very easy to look at. And so I decided to give you something that's more like a school drawing, but that I hope will be useful for you to understand the structure of the Inferno and Purgatorio and Paradiso. Let me mention that this idea of a travel in the afterlife was not only Dante. Actually, Dante's model must have been Homer in the Odyssey has Ulysses going to the afterworld, and Virgil in the Aeneid has Aeneas also taking a trip in the underworld. There is also big polemic now with a German scholar who says that Dante was they committed plagiarism, because this whole idea of the trip in the afterworld was already in a book of a Arab author. We can talk more about this accusation, but let's move on to the, oh, I'm so sorry. That's certainly not what I wanted to do, but I can see all of you for a minute. Okay, I'm going back to my slides. Sorry. Okay, so I decided that this is a picture that maybe will give you a better idea. And we will go into more detail in the two parts of it. So the part that you see below is the Inferno, right? And what's very important of this picture is for you to see that this is the sphere that you see is the globe, right? Is the earth. And you see a conical structure, see now upside down, and that's the Inferno. And it is conical because the story in the Bible is that God threw Lucifer, who was an angel, into the earth, and his fall created this big conical hole, let's say, which is the Inferno. But then all this dirt, all this ground traveled through this budella, so through this sort of a gut in the earth, and emerge on top of the earth to create the mountain of purgatory. So there is really a symmetrical correspondence there. And then here in the same image, you can see all the circle of the paradise, each of which corresponds to a planet or a star. We have the moon, we have Mercury, we have Venus, and I'll have an image more in detail for you. But I wanted you to have a sense of how complicated this whole structure is, so much so that those who study Dante need to have this kind of map in mind in order to understand where they are. Okay, so let's go a little bit more in detail in the Inferno. So you have a sense of where we are going to go with the images. So now you see it upside down, right? And here there is Porta dell'Inferno, which is the door to Inferno. Selva here is the dark wood where Dante begins his journey. Jerusalem, of course, is Jerusalem. I will point out just a few of the characteristics, and we can come back to this image whenever you want. This is actually a good image that we could use too in a handout if you enjoy seeing all the detail. Unfortunately, it's written in Italian, but I'm sure on the web it's possible to find something similar to this in English. So there is the Antinferno. The Antinferno is before hell. And here what's interesting is that Dante puts the Ignavi. Ignavi are those who don't make choices. So their guilt is not taking sides. And it's very interesting that Dante thought that this was a form of guilt and sin. Then there is the Acheronte. So you can see in the creation of Inferno that Dante inherits a lot of element from the Greek and Roman mythology. For example, the Acheronte is a river that is in the mythology, in the Greek mythology. And so is the Styx that we will encounter later in one of these, the Bolge. And so is the city of Dis, which is the city of Satan. So many images you will see when I showed you some illustration of the Divine Comedy. Inherent monsters and characters from the mythology, Greek and Roman mythology. So right after Antinferno and the river of Acronte, we find Limbo. That's the first circle where there are those who have not been baptized. And Virgil, who is the guide, who helps, who guides and helps Dante through the Inferno, was in limbo, and he has been summoned from limbo by a saint, Saint Lucy, I believe, who was sent by Beatrice, to ask Virgil to help Dante to do this very difficult and challenging travel. So here there are other things that you will see. This is the seventh cerchio, or so the seventh circle is the circle of the people are violent. And the people are violent are divided. And here too, I want you to think about among three areas. There are omicidi, so those who are violent against other people, and then those who are violent against themselves, and then those who are violent against nature and against God. And it's interesting, I think, very interesting to see that the people who are violent against other people are less culpable in the structure of Inferno for Dante than the people who are violent against themselves and against God and nature. Le Bolge are sort of cliffs that are united by different bridges. And again, I want you to notice that at the end of Inferno, you have the people who have betrayed somebody. And so people have betrayed their relatives, who have betrayed the country, who have betrayed their guest, and who have betrayed their benefactor. And here you see Lucifer. So Dante's evaluation of guilt and sins is a very interesting element of this work. And we can certainly come back to that. Okay, now a little bit about the structure of purgatory and the structure of paradise. Okay, paradise and purgatory. Let me make it a little bigger so you can enjoy the picture. Here again, so the idea in purgatory, I think it's important to understand that in purgatory, Dante is going himself through a travel to redemption. So he will be tested and he will be interrogated. There are parts in which he is interrogated and called upon explaining, for example, charity, or explaining. It's almost like a Sunday school exam that once in a while Dante has to take to show that he is repented and that he has understood the major element of the Christian and Catholic doctrine. And all of these people are not like the people in the hell that had no hope of being redeemed or being able to go to paradise. The people in purgatory after the judgment day will be able to go to paradise. Finally, there is the images of heaven. These are the different circles. Each circles have different saints and different stars. And as you can see the planets, right? And the sun, I want you to notice, is just one of the planets, of course, because for Dante, that's how the galaxy, that's how our universe was organized. And we'll come back to this toward the end when I'll remind you of really the view of the world that was dominating Dante's culture. Okay, I mentioned a little bit why it's called Divina, and I mentioned to you the role that Boccaccio had in calling it La Divina Commedia. When I tried to restudy when it was written, I found out a lot of stories on the internet. And so I tried to rely on more scholarly work. And I think we can say that Dante started writing something before his exile. He had some ideas, but he really did most of the writing between 1307 and 1320. And it was thus written all when he was in exile. So that's really remarkable and explains why, while he was in exile, it was so important to him to have patrons, to have supporters among these powerful people who would host him and who would maintain him while he was doing this very important work. For a while, there was the idea that the last 13 cantos were lost, and his son Jacopo offered to complete it. But then, fortunately, and this is a story that Boccaccio tells, because Boccaccio wrote a little treatise on the Divine Comedy, and fortunately, Dante appeared in a dream to his son Jacopo and told him where the last cantos of the Paradiso were, and so they were um, uh, found, and he did not have to complete it, fortunately. Okay, on this slide, I want to talk about two important elements of the work. And it seems like a strange juxtaposition, but I think it's an interesting, I hope an interesting one. First of all, I want to show you this image more closely. And I encourage you to look on the web, because there is a great quantity of images of this illustration. These are illustrations by Gustave Doré, and he was French. He lived between 1832 and 1883, 1832 and 1883. He was a printmaker, and all the illustrations for the Divine Comedy were woodcuts. And that is really remarkable. And I was talking with Tiziana about this today, because it seems like impossible to think that one individual person could do this work. But hopefully he had a help with some of his, let's say, students. And you will see more of this decoration. In Italy, they are very famous, and I think there are many, many editions of the Divine Comedy that have this illustration by Doré. Okay, this, I want to speed up a little bit, but this slide show you the rhymes in the Divine Comedy. And I thought it was very important that you would see it, because the that is one of the reasons why it's so hard to translate this work. The translation in rhyme that I have looked at, I found to be rather stifling and not pleasant to read. I had to say the translation in prose at least had the benefit of clarity. Dante wrote the whole poem in what is called the terzina incatenata. So the verse are hendecasyllables. So there are 11 syllables in every verse, and the rhyme are normally repeated 3 times, alternated with other rhymes. Only the first rhyme and the last one are repeated only twice. So I'm going to read this quickly in Italian. Nel mezzo del cammin di nostra vita mi ritrovai per una selva oscura che la diritta via era smarrita. Ah, quanto a dir qual era e cosa dura esta selva selvaggia e aspra e forte, che nel pensier rinnova la paura, tante amara che poco è più morte, ma per trattar del ben che io vi trovai, dirò dell'altre cose chi vo scorte. Okay, why is Dante so important? Why was he important before in the medieval time? Why his work was so important for his contemporaries? I found an essay that I put on your handout that explains these two important aspects of his work. He still reflects the medieval ways of thinking in having a religious inspiration and a moral objective. But he was looking also, he was writing from a very subjective perspective. When you read it, you know that he's talking about himself. He's fainting when too much pain is testing his ability. He is fainting when the light of God is too impressive to be able to behold it. He was writing about political essays, and one of the political disputes, of his time, of which we talked about last time, and he has a beautiful way of representing nature. One element in order to understand, in particular, the Inferno, is the doctrine of contrapasso. So the sinners are punished in a way that correspond to their sin. So the example that I like best is the punishment for sorcerers, astrologers, and false prophets, because they were faking the future. They were telling people a future that they couldn't read. In the Divine Comedy, they are condemned to have their heads turned toward the past. So that's a typical example of contrapasso. And in some of the images, we will see other examples. Other important characteristic are allegories and similes. Allegories is when Dante uses an object, a natural object, often to represent something else. So the trip he's taking is an allegory for his capacity to repent and become a better person. The three wild animal that he encounters in the first canto represent, as you can see, three different vices. And in general, there is a correspondence where nature represents something that is beyond itself. Simile, on the contrary, are in some ways easier to understand, but they are beautiful in my estimation. I find some of the similes that he uses, for example, when the soul are moved by Chiron to go on the boat in order to cross Acheronte, the river, and they are represented like leaves that are carried by the wind. There is a love of nature in presenting, the representation of the leaves, but that are to represent the soul. That is very, to me, very modern. Okay, one passage that I do want to read for you, and then I know I am up to 40 minutes, more or less. So I'll be a little bit quicker on the images. But I thought that I will read this for you. This is what's written on the door of the Inferno, the door to hell. I think it's important that you have a sense of how the text read and how the translation read. This is the translation by Langdon. And I think, I hope many of you will sign up for our third meeting, when we will actually do a book club on some passages, some cantos. But I think it's important that you have a sense of how the text read before you sign up. Per me si va nella città dolente, per me si va nell'eterno dolore, per me si va tra la perduta gente. Giustizia mosse il mio alto fattore, fecemi la divina potestate, la somma sapienza e il primo amore. Dinanzi a me non fur cose create, se non eterne, e io eterna duro. Lasciate ogni speranza voi che entrate. You may remember we made the last verse is used in contemporary Italian in a sense to make jokes when you are telling, for example, a group of men or people, men or women, who are not very fond of feminism, and they are coming in to a conference on feminism, you would tell them, lasciate ogni speranza voi che entrate. So it's used for humor sometimes. Okay, now I go sort of quickly. These are images from Dore. They are very famous passages. Un vecchio bianco per antico pelo is Charon, who, as you can see, crosses the Acheron, is the first mythological figure that Dante uses in the Divine Comedy. I would love to make a talk on all the monsters that are in the Divine Comedy. This is Minos. He was a very cruel king, and he was in Virgil, Aeneid, and Dante uses him because he has a very long tail. And so when Minos wrap his tail around himself, according to how many times he wraps his tail, the sinner will know to which circle of hell he or she has to go. This is another monster. It's called Geryon. It was supposed to have 3 heads and 6 arms and 6 legs. But actually, Dante changes it and makes it of having 3 natures. And so it has the head of the man, has the body of a lion, and then the rest of his body is of a snake. Yes, of a snake. What I think is very interesting about this one is the fact that um, is the symbol of fraud, and so it's one of the last sinners. This is a passage from the Canto Quinto, which I recommend to read for next time. I want you to hear the music in these verses. Amor che al cor gentil ratto s'apprende, amor che a nullo amato amar perdona. These two sinners are um, sinners because they gave in to their adulterous love. And so, just like a passion can, how can I say, carry people to actions that they would not normally do, they are in this canto carried by a very strong wind. And Dante has a great pity for these two lovers and has so much pity that he actually faints. Another place where there is a lot of compassion on Dante is for Pierre de la Vigne. Sometimes you'll find in literature Pierre de la Vigne. Um, Dante was curious about these words and so asked Virgil, who are these? And Virgil says, try to take one of these little sticks. And Dante breaks a stick, and from the stick comes a voice and comes blood. And this is the story of Pierre de la Vigne, who was a suicide. And he was a suicide because he had worked for a king who accused him of betraying him, and he was put in prison, and there he killed himself. And Pierre de la Vigne lived in the same century as Dante, and he killed himself in 1249. And so he was, if you want, a very recent case, and Dante puts him here. And again, although he puts him in hell, you can feel when you read the poetry that there is a lot of pity and compassion for this sinner. Okay, briefly, I want to remind you of what were the major elements of Dante's cultural context. First of all, as I showed you in the circle of paradise, Dante was before the Copernican revolution, and so he thought that the earth was at the center of the universe and the sun was circulating around the earth. So that wasn't just an astronomical theory. It wasn't just astronomy. It was a philosophy that put human beings at the center of the universe. And that is really the way in which Dante thought. And it's certainly very different from how we think of the universe now. So that's one of the reasons why Dante, in many ways, is far from us, but also very interesting for us to read. And of course, because that was the religious view that he held, that was Christianity, that was Catholicism. I haven't said much about the purgatory and the paradise, but from all that I've said so far, you can see how much there is to say. This is the end of paradise. And I wanted you to see this beautiful image by Doré of the circle of heaven. And this last line, l'amor che muove il sole e l'altre stelle, is important because it's an allusion to God and God's love, but also because I wanted to tell you that the last word of all the three cantiche, Inferno, Purgatorio, e Paradiso, is the word stelle, so the word stars. And that I think it's very interesting. Another point that I want to stress is that here Dante says, imagination, fantasy cannot help me anymore. And so when he has to describe God, he once again falls and is not able to. And this is a very important element of what he believed. Um, I thank you for listening. I think it's wonderful you're willing to talk and to hear about Dante. I wish I could tell you more. I have more. I'll be happy to talk during the question and answers. I have discussed with Tiziana what to read for next time for what I call the book club on the Divine Comedy. And my proposal is to read for sure the first canto, where there are the three major wild beasts. To read the fifth because it's beautiful and it's probably the one that all Italians remember. I want to read, I think it's 26, I can't remember the number, but the one where Ulysses is, because it's a beautiful canto having to do with knowledge and with the idea that Dante had of the relationship between humans and God. And then, according to your interest, we could add one from Purgatorio and Paradiso, but I think we have plenty with the first three, and I find that both Purgatorio and Paradiso are somewhat difficult to read outside of their context. They are not, the cantos are not easily separable like in Inferno. So I will stop my share. I will stop talking. And I hope that Tiziana has some questions for us. Thank you very much.
First of all, thank you so much, Piranha. This was another great presentation. Thank you. And I just want to add for the next appointment, so that's on May 27th. And so we will share the text that is in public domain. We will add it in the description of the event that's on our website, and I will also send it to everyone who signs up for the book club. And just as a reminder, there is a limit on the number of participants for that event. So it's so if you want to sign up, do it quickly because it's already half full. So so yeah, that's what I wanted to say. And now I'll add I'll give the word to you all. I see there is a first question from Denise, who is asking who leads Dante through the Purgatorio.
Okay, so let's see. Virgil continues leading Dante also through Purgatorio. He cannot go to paradise because he is not baptized. And so at the end of Purgatorio, he will he will disappear when Dante meets with Beatrice. But Beatrice will not lead him for the whole of the paradise. There will be San Bernardo who will lead him part of the way. So Virgil stays for the whole hell and purgatorio. I hope I remember correctly for the whole purgatorio. Thank you.
And then a question from Stefano. Can you recommend an English translation?
Right. Oh my goodness. Tiziana and I have been working on this for the last 2 or 3 months. And when I prepared a handout for the last time, I think I'll make a collection of the translation. There is one in public domain, which is the Langdon, but I'm not a native English speaker. And so I've asked some of my family members to tell me if they thought it was a version that would attract a native English speaker. And the answer wasn't positive. I think the translation in prose, although they lose the poetry, are probably the easiest. Professor Susan Noakes, who teaches a class on the Divine Comedy at the University of Minnesota, uses, can you help me, Tiziana? It's not the singleton. I think it's
I'm
the
trying to remember as well, but
Sims translation. We can certainly put it in the handout or let you know, Stefano. I think it's Singleton, Professor Noakes told me, is a very good translation, but it's not the one she uses, because the one she uses, it's more, I see Dagny has a translation there, right? Is that the one used in the class, Dagny? John Sinclair translation?
You're muted, Dagny. You can unmute. Wait, ask to unmute. Maybe I do that.
There we go.
Okay, there we go.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. I bought, the great courses, that company. If you ever get one, you'll get millions of catalogs from them. Anyway, they have a course on Dante's Divine Comedy, taught by 2 professors, some University of New York, Geneseo.
Geneseo, yep. It's a good school.
And so I've listened to a lot of their lectures, and this is what they recommended for, their students to get. It's a translation by Mark Musa,
Okay.
M-U-S-A.
Sure,
They thought
sure.
that was the most accessible to, students, people like me.
That's the one I have too. And
Okay.
I found it very good. Another one is this Singleton that has the 3 volumes too. So, but I'll do a little more research. I'm sorry. Of course,
and Stephanie's mentioning as well John Sinclair's translation from the 1930s. Available in 3 volumes with the Italian on one side and the English prose on the other.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
I see the question from Laura. So, Tiziana, will we work a little more on the translation? And maybe for those interested in the 3rd event, we could post something on the advertisement.
For sure.
Is that okay? I see a question that I want to pick up because I think it's wonderful. I was myself surprised. This is a question from Laura Muraro, but I thought it was very interesting that Dante took so much of the myths from Greek and Roman inside its its pictures. I also think that the sticks must have gone into Roman and Greek before going to Dante. And so it made me think that in the Middle Ages, the cultures were still more mingled than we think they were. It's not that Christianity totally reject. Those were pagan symbols.
Yeah.
But he uses them. And so maybe there isn't that division that maybe now we think there is. When we study history,
Oh, yeah.
we think they're all,
Yeah.
but I think there is osmosis, and transformation, because Dante transforms these monsters. And then Doré, sorry for the pronunciation, Tiziana, but Doré transforms the images of Dante into something that he likes in 1800. And so there is this continual, revisiting. So
Yeah, and I think you're right. I mean, we try to analyze it and like set barriers, right? Well, this was the pagan, this was the Christian, and so
exactly.
But I was also wondering, I find it really interesting that that first circle is limbo. Like and was that because he wasn't baptized or because Virgil wasn't baptized?
Virgil wasn't baptized, but Dante was. He was a religious man, and he was a deeply religious man. And my sense is that in the 1300 in Italy, Catholicism was definitely dominant. There was no other possible religion. And in particular, if you came from a good family, rich family, they would have had big ceremonies for the baptism, for the weddings. And so I'm pretty sure. Yeah. But what's so interesting reading the Divine Comedy is that the souls and the devils see that Dante is real, while Virgil is a soul. And so they are very upset for the presence of a real body there. I mean, Dante wasn't dead yet. And so what was he doing there? And so it's almost comic when the demons get really upset about the presence of this real human being. So it is funny.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Feel free to unmute yourselves directly if you want to ask a question to Pieranna.
I have a question.
Yes.
If Dante had to go into exile and was angry about that, of course, why did he need to write this poem about his own redemption? It seems like he's sort of blaming himself. Why would he do that? Why wouldn't he be blaming the black Guelphs or whomever drove him out?
Oh, he does. He puts a lot of popes in hell. So that was one of the things I would have loved to do, but really I don't have time. I wanted to find all the popes he puts in hell. And one suggestion I have but I want to go back to your question because it's very important. He put some popes in hell because they were actually not doing what a true leader of the Catholic flock should do. There were the Simoniaci, those that were selling the favors and the penitences for money. The power of the Pope was to mingle with the civil power, and there was the fight between the emperor and the Pope. So all those elements for Dante were not truly good example of religiosity. And so that's why he writes the poem. He goes to exile for political discussions and diatribes in Florence, and he puts some of his enemies in hell, and he puts some of his friends in the good place. But why does he have to redeem himself? I think there are two answers that come to mind. One, after he wasn't able to actually express his love to Beatrice. Beatrice was married to a different man. He actually had some period of a dissipate life from which he was then redeemed through doing his work and writing the Vita Nuova. So Beatrice appears again as the woman angel that helped him to change his matters. So he wasn't a saint all his life. But I think the second and maybe most important idea is that for Dante, every human being is imperfect. And so everybody has to expiate part of our guilt, our sins. None of us is without sins. And so the journey that he takes probably in his idea saves him from purgatory, maybe, because he is redeemed by doing this journey. Or at least the Dante, who is the character of the Divine Comedy, is saved. Of course, the man might not be. I hope I answered your question. It was very good.
Any other questions?
I have a question. So you mentioned Boccaccio was his contemporary who had a very important role in giving not only the title, the Divine, but also in promoting. So how did it go that then the Divine Comedy became accessible to the people over the centuries? So who contributed basically to keep the Divine Comedy alive after Boccaccio?
Right. Boccaccio wrote, Trattatello is called, so a little treatise on the Divine Comedy. And that would make me think that probably the intellectual, the poets, whom, we talked a little bit about this last time, probably they were in communication with each other, because otherwise, how come Dante was famous already? How did Boccaccio hear about Dante? So my sense is that there was a network, different from what we are lucky. We have the internet, but they probably had the possibility of manuscript version that were circulated. And it appears that that's what Boccaccio talks about when he recounts the story of the 13 cantos that were missing, and that, they found with Can Grande della Scala because Dante had sent them to him. So that's how it circulated then. For 2 centuries, though, when I found out that the first edition the Divine Comedy was actually printed in 1555 by a Venetian, Dolce was the last name, and that seemed to me, when I'm trying to reason why was that the famous date, because about a century before, the press was invented, Gutenberg. We have the beginning of the written work being printed and distributed, however limitedly, but we start having the distribution. So your question, Anna, is really how did they do it between Boccaccio's you know, the end of 1300 until the 1500. And it seems to me there must have been manuscript copies. They did talk about the fact that Dante used terzina, that particular rhyme and that particular form, because it was easy to memorize. So I bet people memorize, like we see Homer, you know, the Iliad and the Odyssey, when we have these troubadours, that practically Greek ancient singers who were able to tell a story by memory. So I think those 2 centuries must have been that. That's my speculation.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, and it's
Thank
indeed
you.
incredible to think that it was published for the first time nearly 250 years after he started writing it. So that's pretty, yeah, amazing. But
well, the amanuenses, the convents, and all these monks, and you know, they were very careful in keeping the text. Certainly in the Western world, and I bet even in China and other culture, they were, you know, careful to protect those.
yes, Dagny, go ahead.
Thank you. Is Dante considered at all influential in the beginnings of the Renaissance? Did later writers look back to him and expand on him? How does he fit into the beginnings of the Renaissance?
I like that question, and I wish I knew more on that. It's very interesting. I think Dante is dominant in Italian culture forever, always. And so he could have been also important in the Renaissance. I want to say he was, as I tried to say before, many scholars point out how he is in between the Middle Ages and the modern era. Even I really find a subjective perspective that he brings in. I mean, the courage to write about himself and put himself as the subject of this enormous poem. It's remarkable, it seems to me. So there is an element of the modern world. He was very important for the language, right? Because he decided to use the Vulgare exactly to make it accessible to more people. He could write in Latin, he had written in Latin, but he wanted to write in Italian because the Dolce di Stil Nuovo, for example, was also in Vulgare. So it seems to me that he must have influenced, for sure, the Renaissance. But I cannot give you an example. I do want to connect to this something very important that connects with some of the things that some of you might have experienced. When we were doing the Italian Film Festival, some of you might have listened to some of the lecture that Professor Pacchioni gave. And the first one that he gave was wonderful. He said Italian cinema is very connected with the visual arts, of course, and with literature. And a support for this is given by the fact that when I was reading the article that I put in your handout on Dante and cinema, I found out that 11 of the first Italian silent movies that were made between 1908 and 1911 were concerning Dante and the Divine Comedy. Okay. So to me, it's mind-boggling that this poem has had such an influence along all our history. Of course, Italian kids are forced to read it, right? But still, I think there is something there if we keep reading it. So you have asked me a very good question, and I will do some research.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Laura, I think you had a question, or no? You're-
Nah, I had to rephrase it in my head and now I lost it. I'm sorry.
That's okay.
I know how it happened.
Yeah, all the time.
That's
Me
okay.
too.
I'll say this. I just shared the handout that Piranha is mentioning. I had sent it in the reminder with the link for this event, but I have shared it here again in the chat, so everyone has it, and it has the list of documentation that Piranha used to prepare this event as well. So, any other questions?
I hope those passages make you want to read a little more. It's not easy. I don't want to lie. It's not easy, but it's interesting.
And Piranha, I don't know if you had a chance to look at a question that I shared with you the other day about if psychanalysts have studied Dante and what, what the results of those studies are. I don't know if you had time to dig into that.
Yes, I did. Tiziana, you see, Tiziana always thanks me for preparing these things, but it's amazing the questions she has and how she helps me choose what my interest an American audience too. And she had a beautiful question about whether psychoanalysts have looked at Dante. And yes, the answer it is yes. I found one or two articles. I haven't had the time to read them carefully, but certainly Jung would have been one of the psychologists who considered this idea of the travel and the idea of the, using the travel through what is beyond this life and what is beyond this life, the use of mythical figure. I tease about, I make jokes about the monsters, but actually they are very interesting creatures. And often psychoanalysts and psychologists will use the symbols to help us understand. So I think, okay, Dorothy Sayers was a Jungian and wrote Dark Wood to White Rose. So I'm sure there are connections there. It would be strange if it weren't. You made me, you reminded me of another element that, oh yeah, I don't know, this is probably a silly comment, but since I have shared it with all my family, I will share it with you. Looking at these images by Doré and the use and the description that Dante has of this monster and this whole idea of the journey made me think of how our young people use video games and monsters and, travel through impossible journeys. And there is something, I thought of Dante as doing what the video games do for our children now and doing that for the medieval people. I know it's a little bit of a daring simile, but I found it helped me understand all this fascination with monsters and dark places.
Well, you can just think of Harry Potter.
Yes, yes, that's excellent. Yes.
It's true, yeah. Well, I think we're headed to the end of this presentation, but I think Piranha will take a few more questions with pleasure if there are. And if not, we can.
I thank you for coming and for sharing my fascination with Dante. And I hope to see at least some of you for next time. It will be the last one of our series, but there should be an event in the fall, right, Tiziana?
Yes, I mean, the plan is to continue the series on Dante and to continue it in the fall. So we'll keep you posted on those events as well. So, but yes, if you're able to join us on the 27th, would be great. We're gonna have a nice discussion with Pieranna. So thank you again to everyone for joining. A good
Thank you.
evening to everyone. And
Thank you.
Grazie, Piana.
Thank you.
Thank you.
a presto. Ciao.
A presto. Ciao.
Ciao.
Ciao.